uh, the nervous system, which is what we're going to do for the rest of the semester, and it'll be what we start off with in AMP2, or whoever you take AMP2 with. Now, as far as the book's concerned, the chapters that we're dealing with now are chapters that I've written. And I'm not trying to toot my own horn and say how cool am I, but the point really is the book is going to cover the things that I think are important to some degree. There are some things that I like to stress in my teaching that I didn't necessarily stress in the writing so much, just because it's sort of my personal preference, and it wasn't something that I felt was suited for a wider audience necessarily. But the way that I like to teach the material is reflected in the book. Any A&P book is going to have a series of chapters covering the nervous system. It's a rather dense system to deal with. It's going to have a lot of chapters. The first chapter, which is what we're dealing with tonight, is always about nervous tissue. The anatomy of nervous tissue is about the structure of the cells, and the composition of the tissue itself. And then the physiology of the tissue is about how electrical activity takes place in, what am I trying to say? In nervous tissue. Now, as we learn about that, it's actually going to also cover the electrical activity that's occurring in muscles. The idea of electrical activity in muscles was presented in the previous material in terms of the excitation and contraction coupling, but it didn't go into any detail explaining what's happening with that. So what we learn about nervous tissue electrical activity applies to what's going on in the muscle too. You'll have a overview assignment that looks at muscle and nervous tissue electrical activity. So there will be some questions getting at that. That'll be an overview assignment that you'll complete after finishing the nervous tissue part 1, 2, 3, and 4 assignments. But that'll cover back through the muscle chapter also. Now, for the laboratory material that goes with this, primarily we're looking at the cells that make up nervous tissue under the microscope. I have captured images of that that I'll show you on the screen, like I've done in the past. You're welcome to look at those on your own under the microscope if you want. I'm not going to take specific time out in the class to do that. I'll just show you stuff up on the screen. But if you wanted to spend some more time getting to know that tissue under the microscope on your own, you're welcome to do that. You can come in early before class, or and you can come in here. My afternoon class ends a little bit before 5 o'clock, so for at least a half hour or so before class, you're welcome to come in here and use microscopes. Other times of the week, you're welcome to look at the microscopes. I don't know if I've mentioned the room down the hall before. I think I did. We were talking about tissues, but room 511 is the A&P study room, sort of. It has practically a full complement of all the stuff that's in the lab, all of these models that we deal with. I say practically, there are a few that we don't have, like the arm and leg muscle models down there are really expensive, so we couldn't afford to get another set of those for that study room. But a lot of these other models we have copies of. We also have additional microscopes. I always thought we had older microscopes in there, which we did, but apparently in the past couple of years, we replaced them with this exact type of microscope we have here. And there's at least one of each of the 4 different microscope slide boxes that we have, so you can look at that stuff there. So if you want to look at the microscope slides on your own time, besides the half hour before we have class, you can use that room. It's not used for teaching at all. It's completely available for students to get in and study. Anytime between 8 in the morning and 9 at night. It's kept locked, so you do need to find somebody to open the door for you. If you can find me, then of course I'll open it for you simply, right away. If you can find any of my colleagues, they'll probably be able to open the door for you, but just understand that they might have other things to do, like they might be rushing to get to start teaching class, and if you stop them asking them to open the door, they might not have time to do it. So don't take an offense to that. However, if I'm rushing to go teach class and you stop me, I will take the time and unlock the door, and then I'll just tell my class, sorry I was late, I stopped one of my students. You should always be able to find somebody that is going to open that door. We have a few lab techs working in the department. They're often up on the 6th floor because they do a lot of work with the microbiology classes. But you can find them if you're at all familiar with them. If you've taken micro or anything like that, there's Gail and Callie and Kara, the 3 techs, and they can open the door for you. So there's that. Now, the way that I've sort of set up the class for the, the rest of the semester in general, let me talk about that all, but concentrating on what we're doing in the next couple of weeks. So in the syllabus, there's this guide to what we're doing. Here it is, April 8th, and we're doing nervous tissue. For the lecture component, what I'm going to do is talk about first introducing what the nervous system is in really broad strokes, but then talking about the composition of nervous tissue. And as far as the lab's concerned, it's sort of the same thing. And again, focusing on, no pun intended, the microscope images that I have there. Next week, the lecture material is excitable membranes, which is talking about the electrical activity of nervous tissue and muscle tissue. That's really more of the same chapter that we're dealing here. So I've actually spread this chapter out over 2 weeks. The lab material for next week is central nervous system, which is looking at the structure of the brain and the spinal cord and that sort of thing. I don't know if we'll get to that next week or not. It might take all night to get to understand the excitable membrane stuff. The following week, which is, it says nervous system, is really more of that central nervous system stuff that's lab material for next week. So if we don't get to that by next week, the following week we will. Okay. And in lab material following week, it says cranial nerves, which is sort of a common thing that's studied in the anatomy of the system. So we'll be doing that week. The 4th week of the nervous system material, I call neurological correlates. As far as the textbook's concerned, there's a chapter on what's called the neurological exam. I've learned over the years of talking about this, and before the book was available, this is what I would cover at the end of the semester. If I put neurological exam here, students thought that meant they were taking a test. Okay. The neurological exam is a clinical tool to assess neurological function. So I changed this to say neurological correlates just so it doesn't have that 4-letter word in it that everybody kind of freaks out about. So there's that there. Oh, I should really take those extra credit due date things out, shouldn't I? Anyway, so that'll wrap up the material over the next 4 weeks. And then the week after that is when we have the second lab practical. For some reason, I thought we were actually going to go a week longer than that. Whatever. usually, well, the way that it's supposed to work teaching these evening classes is if I cancel a class, I need to do something to make up for missing that class. And so since I usually go to these conferences, and so I cancel a week there, what I've usually done is had the final exam sort of the week after would normally be. So we'd sort of have, but obviously that's not the way it's set up. So that's not going to happen. Which basically means we had a night off and I didn't do anything to make up for it by having like another class meeting, which is fine. Because actually in the contract for teaching night classes, it doesn't say that I have to have another class meeting to make up for one that I canceled. Another thing that I can offer is, I don't remember exactly how they word it, but something like equivalent work to the time you'd spend in class. We'll say that's what I did. Okay. You do plenty of extra work in this class, working on homework and that sort of thing. I have no ethical conundrums, if that's a good way to put it, with not making up for that class that we didn't have because I went to the conference. That time that I was at the conference, we'll just pretend you spent that week working really hard on getting up on stuff. And that satisfies things. But anyway, so there on May 6th, we'll have that second practical. That's the final exam period. It's not the final exam, it's just the second practical, but that's when we're going to be doing it. And just like the first practical that we had before spring break, that's the only thing we're doing that night. So you'll probably be done within about an hour, but you'll have 2 hours to work on it if you need to. Something new I'm doing this semester, because the way I used to do it, I don't think was very, I don't know, helpful to a lot of students. The final and absolute due date for all work on Blackboard is going to be 5:30 p.m. on the 6th, which means you need to be done with all of the work on Blackboard before you come in on the 6th for the second practical. That includes the online portion of the practical, and there's a cumulative final test that's in there too. So all that has to be done by then. What I used to do is I used to say, well, hell, I'll just give you all the time you need to work on it, okay? And what I've found over progressive semesters is that there are two types of students. There are the students that get the work done, and they do very well in the class. And then there are the students that put it off as long as possible. And they're struggling in that last couple of days to get everything done. And they're running into, submitting things late and waiting for me to check it off so they can go on to the next part, that kind of thing. And they really run out of time to do the work well. A lot of students will just not submit things, or will submit parts of assignments or something like that. So now the official due date for everything is the same night as the practical. When everybody comes in for the practical, I'll go into Blackboard and I'll cut off everybody's access to it. If you haven't finished it by then, you don't have a chance to finish it. I'm giving you a month's notice, okay? Do not put the work off. Any work that you have been putting off, it's time to kick into high gear and get it done, okay? Now, over the next 4 weeks, you do not have 4 sets of assignments, okay? In the current week folder, you have nervous tissues, part 1, 2, 3, and 4 assignments. Those are due April 21st, okay? Not next week, but the week after that, okay? Because next week's folder, which is excitable membranes, does not have any chapter assignments. This is still about the same chapter, okay? So we're doing the anatomy part of this chapter this week and the physiology part of the chapter next week. There's only one set of assignments for that chapter, which will be due at the end of this week here, okay? And then the next week, so after excitable membranes, The next week is the nervous system. And you have the nervous system part 1, 2, 3. There we go. 1, 2, 3, and 4 assignments. Oh, interesting. Okay. So those are actually set to be due the following week. But in that following week, which is week 13, the neurological correlates one, there's nothing in there. Okay. Now there used to be a learning pod assignment in there, but I'm not doing learning pods anymore, so there's not even a learning pod assignment there. There's no assignments here. There's just the reading. This is a link to the chapter on the neurological exam. This other thing in here is a link to a website that I'm going to use as we're talking about that stuff that week. But to go back to looking at the schedule here, okay. This week, nervous tissue, and next week, excitable membranes, that's all one set of assignments. Nervous tissue parts 1, 2, 3, and 4, which are due at the end of this week or before the following week. And then the nervous system week, you have a set of assignments there. Nervous system part 1, 2, 3, and 4, which are officially set to be due before the following week, but you don't have anything the following week, okay, to complete. So that's actually your last set of chapter assignments. Okay. Now, I'm not making the nervous system stuff due 2 weeks later, because 2 weeks later is the lab practical, and everything needs to be done by then. So again, the due dates are largely to keep you on track. So you should finish the last chapter assignment on nervous system by the 29th, and then that last week, by the 28th, and then that last week, the 29th through the 6th, be sure that you have everything finished, and you'll have the lab, the online practical, and the cumulative final to do in that week also.
So
yeah,
we just have to do the lab practical 2 and the cumulative final before we come into the in-class portion.
You have to do everything. Okay. Yes, you have to do the in-class, the online practical and the cumulative final, but you have to have completed everything. If you're keeping on track with the due dates and you finish everything when they're actually due, then yes, that last week you'll only have the online practical, but everything's due then. There is a folder that says Lab Practical 2 and Cumulative Final, which has the study materials for the practical, the outline of the cases, and then the online practical assignment, and then there's an assignment which is the cumulative final. Okay. Have I talked about the cumulative final at all? Okay. It is a 50 multiple choice question test. Okay. As with any multiple choice question test that you have, it has a time limit. The time is always set to be 2 minutes per question. Okay. Not that you only have 2 minutes to work on each question, but rather, for a 10 multiple choice question quiz, you have 20 minutes to do it. So for 50 multiple choice question tests, you would have 100 minutes to do it, which is an hour and 40 minutes. I don't think anybody really needs an hour and 40 minutes for that language test. But that's the way it's set up. The questions that you're going to be answering there are the multiple choice questions you've been answering all semester. What I did to make that test is I just had it pull, I think, 5 questions out of the chapter 1 questions, 5 questions out of chapter 2, 5 questions out of chapter 3, 5 out of chapter 4, 5 out of chapter 5, 5 out of chapter 6, 5 out of chapter 9, 5 out of chapter 10, 5 out of chapter 12, and 5 out of chapter 13/14. Now, we don't actually number the chapters that way in this book. It's unit 1, chapter 1, unit 1, chapter 3, etc. But essentially, if you just went through in order and counted them out, we get to 6, which is the bone thing, and then we skip over to 9, which is joints, and then we go to 10, which is muscle, and 12 is nervous tissue, etc. So I just pulled out 5 questions out of the part 1 and part 2 assignments. I I set it up so that it pulls out of those pools of questions, just like when you're taking these things. But it's just 5, I'm pretty sure, it's just 5 questions from each set. A pool of questions for one of those chapters is somewhere between 20 and 30 questions each. And then the pool of questions for part 2 from that chapter is another 20 to 30 questions. So I'm pulling 5 questions out of 40 to 60 questions for the part 1 and part 2 assignments. What that means is that for each individual attempt made on the task, it's going to look very different. If 2 of you sit down next to each other to take that, and both have it up on your respective computers, you're going to be looking most likely at completely different tests. The likelihood of the exact same questions being pulled out for 2 people is pretty slim. I think there's a total of like 240 or something questions overall. And so 50 out of 240 are pulled for each attempt. And so it's going to be a very different test for each person. Now, it's actually quite straightforward to study for this. All you have to do is go back to the part 1 and 2 assignments that you've been doing all semester and look at them. Those are all the questions that you're going to be testing on. Now, if you took, say, part 1 of chapter 1, and the first time you took it, you got 9 out of 10 questions correct. So it lets you go on to part 2. You've only seen 10 of the questions in that pool. What you can do is go back into that assignment and take it again to see more questions. I don't know exactly how many attempts it takes to see all of the questions in the pool, and it does depend on how many there are in the pool overall. But probably 4 to 6 attempts, you'll probably have seen all of them. So if you've already done something 4 to 6 times, you'll probably have seen all the questions there. But if you've only done it once or twice, there are probably questions in the pool that you haven't seen. So you can go back in there and do them again. And then you have all the questions there. You can look at them, and you'll know the answers because you're studying from them, and hopefully you've gotten them right in the previous attempts. And then when you go to take it, it should be pretty straightforward. It's right there in front of you, the same questions. Now the answer choices will be rearranged. They're always randomized, A, B, C, and D. But as long as you know what the answer is, you'll be able to find it again in the answer choices. It doesn't come up with new answer choices. The thing about doing it that way is when you open up one of those tests for a new attempt, you have to take the test. Okay? The last attempt that you make on the test is the one that goes in the grade book. So if you did it once and you got 9 out of 10, but you need to see it some more, you open it up and you submit that without answering the questions, you have a 0. Okay? Then the 0 is what's in the grade book. Okay? So whatever your last attempt is on the part 1, 2 assignments, whatever, that's the one that's in the grade book. So be sure, if you're studying that way, that you be sure that you do very well on your last attempt there. And it's a great opportunity for you to go ahead and be sure that you get 10 out of 10 on all those things. So you got 9 out of 10 before, you can get 1 more point. That's only going to help your grade in the end. What I used to do in the final exam period is I'd have people take both of these tests on paper in class. Okay, so like you will do, you're going to take the in-class portion of the practical, and then I'd have people take a paper version of the cumulative final. It was a 2-hour period for the final exam, so people should have taken an hour for one test and an hour for the second test, which can be a little bit of a challenge, but most people pretty much did that. Some people would be working on the practical and they'd be about an hour and a half into the period before they finished it and turned it in, so they'll only have a half hour for the practical. I mean, for the cumulative final. So I decided to switch to doing the cumulative final as an online assignment, which was kind of nice because also gave me the chance to make it pull out of the whole pool of questions. When I printed it out, I picked the 50 questions in a minute. The first year I switched to doing it online, the first student that had completed it got a perfect 50 out of 50 score. And she happened to do it before the practical. It was in my night class. It was the first practical I was giving that semester. So when she came in, I just pulled her aside and I said, can you just tell me how you got 50 out of 50 on that so I can let other people know if it's possible? And she said, I did exactly what you said. Went back through all the assignments and looked at all the questions. I knew what they were, and when I took it again, I knew all the answers, and I got 50 right off the bat. So it is a very effective way to prepare for that. Now, you actually get 3 attempts on that test, okay? Sort of like lab quizzes. You've been getting 3 attempts there. What's different, however, is on the lab quizzes, you're getting 3 attempts because they're the exact same 10 questions every time you take it. On this, it's different questions each time you take it, but you only get 3 attempts because you know the questions going into it. You should be able to do it all in one shot, but you get 3. What's different is the best of the 3 grades is the one that goes in the grade book instead of the last. So if you do it once and you get a 35 on it, you say, well, I can definitely do better than that. So you take it again and you get 42 on it. You say, well, I can do better than that. Take it again and you get a 38 on it. The 42 goes into the grade book, not the 38, whatever the best of the 3 is. You ought to take advantage of all 3 attempts, unless you get a 50. Okay? Get a 50, there's no point in taking it again. But if you don't get a 50, it doesn't hurt to take it again. If you get a lower score, it's not going to bring your score down, but the chance of getting a better score just means you can bring things up. Okay? And those 3 attempts that you make are likely to be completely different tests. Okay, over 3 attempts, you'll probably get a few questions repeated, but most likely they're going to be very different attempts. That's what's going on with that. Now, both the online practical and the cumulative final, as their due date, have 5:30 p.m. on May 6th. Just to remind you that you have to complete it before you come in for the practical. So, and I could click on that and show you the exact same due date, but they are the same due date there. So I wanted to show you how things are wrapping up for the rest of the semester. You have a month. Okay? You know that you have to have okay, not a month. You have 29 days, right? 28 days. You know that you have to complete all this work by then. Right? Any work that you haven't completed by now, you can still go back and do. Right? With one exception, which I'll remind you of in a second. But if you haven't done work from a previous chapter, due dates past, you can still do it, and there will be no penalty for turning it late. You're not going to get points off for doing any of those assignments late. You will, however, have to deal with the annoyance of when you do a part 1, you got to wait for me to check it off before you can do part 2. So with that in mind, if you are doing stuff that's past the due date, get started on it early so that you're not all doing it in the last couple of days, the first week of May, and hoping that I'm going to check things off in a timely fashion for you to get things done. If you are waiting for me to check off late assignments, please do other assignments. Don't just say, well, I did part 1, I gotta wait for part 2 in this chapter to go on. Do part 1 in one chapter, do part 1 in another chapter, do part 1 in another chapter, then come back and hopefully I'll have checked things off. And you can let me know that you're waiting for checking off, and I'll try to get in there and do that in a timely fashion. But the other thing you can do is if you haven't gotten 100% correct on the part 1, 2, or 3 assignments, part 3 has nothing to do with the final, but you can still take those over again. Go back into those old assignments that you might have completed by the due date, and you can still do them over and get the best score possible on them. Okay. If you're doing that, if you've already gone through and done part 1, 2, 3, and 4 of a chapter, and you're going to go back and redo some to improve your grade, do them in reverse order. Okay, do part 3. Okay, When you open up part 3 and do it again, the link to part 4 will disappear. The work you did on part 4 doesn't disappear, just the link. Okay? But that's okay because you already did it. Okay? And then once you get 100% on part 3, then go do part 2. Okay? When you open up part 2 to redo that, the link to part 3 will disappear. Okay? It's best to do it in reverse order because if you started with part 1, the link to part 2 disappears and you can't get in to do that until I check it off. So do part 3 first, get that to 100%. It doesn't affect your ability to go back and do part 2 and then to go back and do part 1. Okay. If you do them 1, 2, 3 in that order, you'll have to keep waiting for me to check off things that you've completed. But if you've already done it and you have the links to all of the assignments there in the folder, do them in reverse order. It just works better that way. Okay. You don't have to wait on me so much. So the one thing that you can't do are the Learning Pod assignments. Okay? Because Learning Pod stopped supporting their website, I across the board just stopped that stuff. If you did not complete a Learning Pod up until the one, let's see, what would that be? I can't remember. Whatever March 24th or something like that. I don't remember the exact date. Whatever that due date was. If you haven't completed those at this point, you don't have the chance to do them over. Okay. Yes, the Learning Pod website technically is still there, but I've been saying, going with their stopping support on the 31st, I didn't know what would happen, so I didn't want to say, well, yeah, we'll drag it out a little bit longer and hope everything's okay. If I say, yeah, go ahead and do Learning Pods late, and something happens to the system and I can't get that information that you completed on time, I can't give you the credit for it. So just in keeping with their March 31st end date, that's when Learning Pods were ended. And then anything that was due March 30th or later, that was the extra credit assignment. Okay, and you cannot go in and do those to get extra credit points on those. That's all finished up. And I think I have gone in and put in the extra credits for everybody, which I think was a possible total of 20 points or something like that, which the original extra credit assignment would have only allowed you to get up to 15 extra credit points. So switching to the completed Learning Pods, if you did all of them for the rest of the semester, you get 20 points. That's better than the original extra credit offer. But that's passed. And so I was noticing as I was showing you the schedule there that it said extra credit due date 2 and 3, and that's what I need to erase those. They're no longer relevant. So you can't go back and do Learning Pods. Those, you lost that chance. I believe in the Learning Pod assignments where it used to have the link to go to the Learning Pod webpage, I switched to say that the Learning Pod assignments are closed or something like that. And if you didn't complete it by the 31st, you won't get a chance to do that. So all that's it. Any questions about what you need to do to finish up for the semester? Everybody's clear on this? What I'm going to do probably in a couple of weeks, I can't show it to you because it's on the break, but there's a button I can push that will print out reports for everybody. And I can show you all of the assignments and your score on each of the assignments. You can look at that and see what you haven't completed, what you haven't gotten to 100% that you can redo, and it'll show you what your grade looks like at that point. Okay. I'll print that out just so I know everybody has seen that. Okay. So you can't say, oh, I didn't realize I had to do such and such assignment. Okay. That'll be my very explicit demonstration to you what you have to do. What I'm going to give you, that report, is basically what it shows under my grades for you. Okay. But some people just need that little extra thing. It works as a check sheet or something like that. I don't know. One problem with the reports that I'll print out, it does not indicate when you were exempted from a makeup assignment. So you'll have to look at my grades for that. And I can't remember now if I'm caught up on that for you guys or not. Okay. I know I caught up on a few classes, but I guess I didn't get to that for you. So I will be doing that. Actually, this Friday, I have a meeting in the morning and I have a meeting at lunch, but I don't teach on Fridays. So I'm going to just use Friday as my catch-up day. And I'm going to try to get all the grading done and the exemptions and that sort of stuff taken care of. So I think that's everything I want to mention. Questions? Anybody? We're good? All right. So back to today's material. So we're now starting Unit 3. And again, I'm not trying to toot my own horn or anything like this, but these are mostly chapters that I wrote. In this unit, there are 6 chapters ending with the endocrine system. I wrote everything but the endocrine system chapters. What we're looking at tonight and next week is this first one, which is the nervous system and nervous tissues. And then the week of the 22nd, I think it was, then we'll be looking at the anatomy of the nervous system and somatic nervous system, those 2 chapters together. Those 2 chapters are the what the nervous system part 1, 2, 3, and 4 assignments are about. I just rolled them all into one set of assignments. Okay. The autonomic nervous system is a topic for A&P 2. Okay. And then the neurological exam chapter is the one that we're going to do the last week there. Okay. And that's about the clinical connections to neurological function that we'll be talking about. Really, the last 2 weeks between these 2 chapters on the structure and function of the nervous system and this one on the clinical correlations, they all kind of go together. It's sort of different ways of looking at the same stuff. So that'll all kind of go together thematically. And the autonomic nervous system chapter and the endocrine system chapter in this unit are chapters for A&P 2. Okay. If you do happen to take A&P 2 from one of my other colleagues, you won't be using this book. They have a different book. You need to talk to that person if you sign up for A&P 2 with somebody else about their policy for people coming in from a class that uses different textbook. In the past, we had an instructor that used his own favorite book that was different from, actually we had 2. They used their own favorite book that was different from what most of us used. Now I'm that guy. But when I had people coming to me in A&P 2 that took A&P 1 from one of these other guys, I did not require them to buy a new textbook, okay? Because the textbooks are all kind of very similar. They're all talking about the body. They're all set up in the same sort of chapter structure for the most part. Sometimes they just present the material a little bit differently. They use different artwork. They go into some things in more detail or less detail between the 2 books, whatever. But I didn't require anybody to buy a new textbook for my class if they bought a different textbook for somebody else's class. I don't know how my colleagues are going to approach that for people leaving my A&P 1 classes and going into their A&P 2 classes. One reason why it might not be quite so easy to make that switch is that some of my colleagues use a website that's dedicated to the textbook. When you buy the textbook at our bookstore, it comes with an access code for this website. And so they might require you to have access to that website because they might use it for some graded material in the class. If you don't have access to it, then you won't be able to do the graded work for the test, for the class. If that is the case, that they say, well, you're welcome to take A&P 2 from me, but you're going to have to buy the textbook that comes with access to the website. Ask them if it's okay with them if you use the ebook version of the textbook. Okay? The reason for that is that if you buy the textbook outright at our bookstore, it's $370. You can buy the access code, which gives you an electronic version of that same textbook for, I can't remember if it's $100 or $130, but whatever it is, it's less than buying the whole schmear at our bookstore. And I think you can buy that at the bookstore by itself. It won't have the lab manual, and if they require the lab manual, ask if you can get a used copy of that, which you can rent through the bookstore possibly, or buy on Amazon for real cheap. And if it comes to that, I actually have a few extra copies of the old lab book, which I'd be willing to part with on a first come, first served basis, if you're allowed to use a used textbook, a used lab manual. So check with that. Or they might say, you're fine to use whatever textbook you have for the other thing, and you just continue using this. You might want to look at their textbook, which is on reserve at the library, and you can look at, if they're talking about something and it doesn't make sense in this textbook, you can go look at the textbook in the library. You can't check it out, but you can look at it in the library. So if you are taking AP2 from somebody else, which I will not give you a hard time about, either it's because you don't like me, you don't like the format of my class, you don't like all the crap I make you do on Blackboard, or you just didn't sign up in time to get the class you wanted, which is not an issue yet. None of my classes are full. But for whatever reason you might not be taking AP2 from me, I will not take any personal offense to it. If it is personal, you're probably not going to talk to me about it anyways. But if you are taking it from somebody else, I'd kind of like to know what they say about using the textbook that they require. And I hope to someday, and I don't think it's going to be by next week, by next semester, get them to start adapting this textbook too. We'll see. But all right, I've been talking a whole lot. We're 45 minutes in the class. So let's actually do some stuff. So moving on to the nervous tissue chapter, what it actually starts with is a very basic introduction to what the nervous system is. And you might very well get tired of me saying things like this, but I am going to kind of tell you a little bit about why I wrote the book the way I did in these chapters. This sort of thing is in the beginning of any nervous system set of chapters. It always has to say, this is the nervous system. And then it talks about what nervous tissue is. And my main experience, my graduate degree is actually in neuroscience. So I know quite a bit about the nervous system. And general textbooks, which are usually not written by people with expertise in the nervous system, will oversimplify what this is getting at. So I want to present it in a little bit different way so that you can understand where it's coming from. Okay. When we're talking about the nervous system, we'll often start by breaking it up into more manageable chunks, what I like to refer to as divisions of the nervous system. And the first division is a strictly anatomical division. Okay? There's the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And the picture that we have here kind of gets at what those are. Okay. The central nervous system is very explicitly the brain and the spinal cord. Okay. Which obviously the brain here and then the spinal cord running down here. They're largely defined by the fact that they're contained within the skull and the vertebral column. Now, it's not a perfect way to define brain and spinal cord as being within those bony structures, because there are some things coming off of the spinal cord or the brain that are technically peripheral because they're outside of the brain or spinal cord, but they haven't left the cranial or vertebral cavities yet. Okay. So it's not perfect to define them by the bones that contain them, but that's a pretty good way to think about it. And then the peripheral nervous system is everything else. Okay. Now, there is the organ that's the brain and the organ that's the spinal cord. And then everything else falls into basically two types of organs. There are nerves and there are ganglia. Ganglion is singular, ganglia is plural. A ganglion is a cluster of nerve cells or neurons, which we're going to talk about a little bit later on, found in the periphery. For, quote, lower life forms, invertebrate animals like worms or bugs or whatever, they don't have a brain and spinal cord. Their nervous system is made up just exclusively of ganglia. Now, they have a much smaller, much simpler nervous system than we do, but they get by with just these kinds of structures. What makes vertebrates different from invertebrates is the development of the brain and spinal cord. Okay? And so we have this central nervous system that's a special adaptation of the whole vertebrate class of organisms, animals. And we also have ganglia nerves that extend outside of that. Invertebrates basically only have ganglia nerves. Okay? So ganglia are clusters of these cells. If you look at a bug, its brain, so to speak, is just a ganglia. And they usually have a few scattered around, sort of dealing with things in their local, that part of the body. And then a nerve is a bundle of nerve fibers. Now, the ganglion contains the cell body of the cell, of the neuron. And then the nerve contains the fiber that extends away from that. Now, part of what I mean by that isn't entirely clear because we haven't looked at the structure of the tissue yet, but that is kind of what's going on here. And that's a little oversimplification because sometimes the cell body's in the central nervous system and then the fibers in the nerve, in the periphery. And we'll get into examples of that as we're studying this stuff in more depth. But that's the most basic division, central versus peripheral. And there are some pretty major functional differences between that. The main one, which you may be familiar with, has to do with tissue damage and repair. Nervous tissue in the brain and spinal cord, central nervous tissue, does not heal very well. If you have damage to the brain or spinal cord, it's usually going to cause some very severe neurological deficits, which are not likely to heal. If somebody breaks their back and they have damage severing their spinal cord from a specific point down, they lose all ability to control muscles from that point down in their body, and they cannot feel anything touching the skin up to that point in their body. So they've just completely lost those functions, okay? Because the spinal cord doesn't heal back very well. If the spinal cord's intact, but there's damage to the nerves in the periphery, there'll be some loss of function for a little while, but those nerves can heal back, or ganglia can heal back a little bit. Nerves more often than ganglia just because of the relative sizes that we're talking about. But central nervous system does not heal from injury very well. Peripheral nervous tissue does. That's the big functional difference between them, or physiological difference between them. Now, part of the reason I'm doing this, setting this out, is that other books will try to start to force other divisions into this anatomical division. So in the book, I make a point of, actually, where is it? Oh, I go in to talk about a few other anatomical points like gray versus white matter. We'll talk about that later when we're looking at the structure of the brain. Come on, where is it? Oh, and then I go into the functional divisions of the nervous system. So a lot of textbooks try to shoehorn the functional divisions into the central and peripheral divisions. And most often what they do is they say, here's the central nervous system, and they don't say anything more about it. And then they say, here's the peripheral nervous system, and within that we have these functional divisions. Okay? That's very misleading. The functions that I'm going to describe here are found across the periphery and the central nervous system. Okay, and I'll give you some examples of that. So first off are the basic functions of the nervous system. So if we talk about any system in the body, we want to kind of start with what does it do? Okay. So like the skin helps protect us, and it helps regulate body temperature. And it's the sensory surface for touch, those kinds of things. That's the functions of skin. Or the skeleton gives us support, gives us protection around body cavities. And it's the basis of the joints for movement, that kind of thing. There are functions for each system. The basic functions for the central nerve, or for the nervous system, fall into sort of three groups. The main ones are sensory and motor functions. Okay? Sensory functions are our reception of information from the environment around us. That's a very general definition because there's different levels of sensory processing. There's unconscious or subconscious sensory processing, and there's conscious sensory processing. Generally speaking, when we're talking about subconscious processing, we call that sensation. And when we're talking about conscious processing, we call that perception. When you perceive something, that implies that there's this conscious recognition of that. When your body is just reflexively responding to some sensory stimulus, that's just sensation. Then motor function is the response. Now, we use the word motor because we're usually referring to controlling muscles, but it's a little bit broader than that. Most of it is controlling muscles. It can be skeletal muscle, it can be cardiac muscle, it can be smooth muscle. But also we can control glandular tissue. Okay. Sweating is a response. Okay. So you're hot, you start to sweat. Okay. The sensation coming in is the heat, and the response to that is the sweat. We call that a motor response, although it's not really any muscle tissue doing anything. It falls into that group there. So those are the two big things. It's receiving information and responding to that information. That can be very simple, like touching a hot stove and pulling your hand away. Okay? It's a reflex. Or it can be very complex, like driving a car. You're seeing and hearing all of the things around you. You're feeling the movement of your car. You're feeling where your hands are, holding onto the steering wheel, etc. All of those sensory perceptions are coming in, and then your response is how do you, guide the car and stop in time that you don't run through a red light. It's a very complex set of behaviors, but it still comes down to sensory information coming in and motor responses causing you to do something. There's actually a third basic function that's kind of in the middle of that, which is called often integration. Now, the car driving example is a good place to talk about integration. Okay? You're seeing the road around you. You're seeing the cars that you're passing or that are passing you, or that are in oncoming traffic or in cross traffic on other streets. You're hearing sounds like honking or just cars driving by, or dogs barking or kids screaming or whatever. You're getting a lot of sensory information coming in multiple different modes: visual, auditory, smell. You can smell asphalt. Somewhere around here somebody's trying to fill in a big hole. Okay. That information comes in, and you then have to decide what to do to respond to it. Okay. So you hear a dog barking. You don't necessarily slam on your brakes because you don't know if that dog is going to be in your way. It might be some dog in somebody's yard behind a fence that's not going to get out and cause any problems. So you have to process the information and decide how to respond to it. That's referred to sometimes as integration. integrating sensory information together so that you can make an informed decision on how to respond to it. It can be a fairly simple integration, not necessarily at the conscious level like the example of driving a car, but if you touch a hot stove, there's a reflexive action that the sensory information comes in, tells your spinal cord to cause retraction or withdrawal of your hand. You also have to consider your sense of balance. So if you pull your hand back, is that going to throw you off balance? That sort of thing. So there's a little bit of integration even at the reflexive level. But those are the basic functions that are at the root of everything that we're going to talk about for neurological function, from the simplest to the most complex things. Now, the other functional division to talk about has to do with how we control the body. And while there's sensory and motor components to this, we basically pay attention to the motor aspect of it. And so it comes down to what parts of the body are being controlled. Now, the two divisions are the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. And in fact, in the book, I have separate chapters about that, addressing the functions of those two divisions. The somatic nervous system, I like to define as being your voluntary conscious nervous system. That is an oversimplification. There is some aspects of it that can be involuntary or unconscious, but anything that you have voluntary control over or conscious perception of would fit into the somatic nervous system. Linking it to the motor response side of function, it basically means anything that has to do with controlling skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is voluntary muscle. There are involuntary skeletal muscle controls, like breathing, but you have the option of taking over voluntary control of that. So you're probably not really thinking about how you're breathing right now, but I'm talking, which is the voluntary aspect of respiratory control. So it can be voluntary, it can be conscious perception, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, just based on how we process things. The autonomic side is really how we regulate homeostatic mechanisms. Now, it's not the only way that we regulate homeostatic mechanisms, but anything with the nervous system has to do with controlling cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, or glandular tissue is autonomic function. So regulating heartbeat or digestive function, or controlling your bladder. When you're sitting in here, you don't want to void your bladder. You want to do it in a more socially appropriate place sometimes. All of those sorts of things have to do with cardiac or smooth muscle. Or, like I mentioned earlier, sweating, that's a glandular tissue. Any nervous control of any of those kinds of tissues is autonomic. Now, the endocrine system also plays a role in homeostasis. So it's not just about the autonomic system regulating homeostasis, but any homeostatic mechanisms where we're controlling cardiac, smooth muscles, or glandular tissue, that's the autonomic system. Now, as I was quickly showing you the different chapters in this part of the book, I said that the autonomic system chapter is for A&P2, as is the endocrine chapter. As a department, before I started teaching here, they made a decision of where to split A&P1 and A&P2. And based on the progression through chapters in any typical book, you're sort of at the halfway point in the middle of the nervous system. So as a department, my colleagues, some of them now retired, decided that we wanted to split it so that most of the somatic nervous system is covered in ANP1, except for what we call special senses, which means eyes, ears, smell, taste, that kind of stuff. So special senses are in ANP2, and then anything in the autonomic nervous system is in ANP2. That's the way it was explained to me when I started teaching here. That's the way I teach it. To some extent, the way that I set up the book works with that, so that there's an autonomic system chapter. Other books, like the one that my colleagues use, the autonomic system is actually part of the peripheral nervous system chapter, which drives me crazy because there's central nervous system aspects to the autonomic system. But we're not going to get into that issue right here. Anyways, that's where we start. We separate things out. So other than right now when I'm telling you what the autonomic system is in general, that it's controlling a lot of homeostatic mechanisms, we're not going to talk about that this semester. We're going to concentrate on the somatic nervous system, except for our conscious perception of vision, sound, taste, smell, and balance. Those are the special senses, which are a topic for ANP2. Personally, I like it if we would make the division between the two classes a little bit more complete. We only do somatic system in ANP1, we only do autonomic system in ANP2. That's actually how I set up the book. So when we get to the somatic nervous system chapter, which will be part of the nervous system set of assignments, we actually won't be covering the sensory part of that chapter, which is the special senses. Instead, we'll just be covering the last two sections of the chapter, which is less than half of the chapter. So all of the anatomy of the central nervous system and half of, or less than half of the somatic nervous system chapters together make up the assignments, make up the material for the assignments on the nervous system. And I'll remind you of that when we get closer to that in a couple of weeks. But it does have a bearing on what we're talking about here, the divisions in the nervous system. Now, this next picture here, I've never been happy with, okay? I have to take a lot of responsibility for things that I don't really like about the chapters that I wrote. And so this is one of them. As I was talking with the editors and I was explaining, I didn't like how other books tried to shoehorn talking about autonomic and somatic nervous systems in terms of peripheral and central. That it just didn't work. The editor wanted me to come up with a figure that kind of depicted that. So this figure is really just, come on, where is it? An adaptation of this figure here. But it's sort of pointing at some other things, trying to say, these are the peripheral components of the, yeah, so this is the peripheral nervous system, this is the central nervous system, and then just listing under each one the various somatic, autonomic, and other functions associated with it. I don't really like the picture. The editor kind of forced me to do it this way. And I couldn't think of a better way to present it. So hopefully that does give you a little idea of how the functional divisions that I'm talking about kind of map onto the anatomical division of central versus peripheral. But I don't want to go into that anymore here. Okay. So that wraps up the first section, which is the basic structure and function, meaning really divisions of the nervous system. There's a little bit that I skipped over in there that I will talk about a little bit more when we're dealing with the tissue stuff, which is the next section. Now, this is a really easy place to make a transition between the two. So let me go ahead and we'll take a break now, which is a little earlier than usual. So we'll take 20 minutes, and at 5 till, according to that clock, we'll start back up, and we'll look at the tissue, and with that, I'll include the microscope material, which is basically the lab material for this, for tonight. So we'll go ahead and take that break, 20 minutes, see you back here.